Yes, quiet, good, great. Welcome to all old and new friends of the Schemmel Forum. We are in for a treat today, in line with our Schemmel goal of bringing the world to Scranton. Today's speaker has both local and global credentials, equally well-deserved. On the local level, Ira has transformed a mere Ivy League university into a powerful community asset. From the ivory tower, he has reached across Chestnut Street to embrace and transform a local high school in need by offering the help and wisdom that Penn could offer, in exchange for offering Penn faculty and students the opportunity to understand their community and their responsibility for it. As I'm sure you know, these transformations go in both directions. It always works that way. After several years of trial and error, Ira spread the word to other institutions in the U.S. and then reached abroad. And so the model of a university not only as a valuable resource to its students and faculty, but to the community, is now flourishing in Melbourne, as well as Syracuse and Johannesburg, Belfast, Mexico City, and Newark, to mention just a few. I've had the pleasure and honor of being in some of these places with Ira, pressing for my particular interest in having universities not only be good citizens, but in teaching their students what it means to be a good citizen. That will sound familiar to some people in the room. When you hear Ira speak, you'll recognize his distinct New York accent. He adheres to Shakespeare's admonition to Polonius, "To thine own self be true." He came to Philadelphia as an undergraduate and never left. But though he is a Philadelphian with a global sphere of influence, he is true to himself. Please welcome Ira Harkavy.
I want to thank Sandra for that extraordinarily kind introduction. I just want to indicate that Polonius may be right, but others would say that like holding on to New York accent just so I have a tin ear. But either way, it's fine. And I could also say that Sandra and Maury have been colleagues and friends of mine since the mid-1980s, and it has been a pleasure. As much as I've had incredible lessons and learnings from working with Sandra, and we have partnered for many years. From the time Sandra would run programs for Governor Casey and brought me there to speak. So we've continued that tradition, and it is a pleasure to be in Scranton. So I want to thank all of you for having me here today. What I'd like to do is describe this work in terms of its global and local manifestations, and talk to you about why universities, in my judgment, represent the key institution for, in fact, achieving the democratic promise of America, as well as achieving democratic societies all over the world. And that picture you see was taken in Belfast at a global forum around the kind of work I'm going to describe. And if you look to what would be the far right, you'll see someone you'll recognize at the bottom. And I didn't note that until last night. I was looking at the slides, my team put it together, and there's Sandra, right there, at that meeting, standing in Belfast City Hall with people from all over Europe and around the world, and Maury's there too, and Maury's there also. So if you look at this picture, and I literally did not know that until last evening. So this shows that what Sandra said is true, that we've traveled in the same circles and worked together, and that's a meeting that I'm going to be talking about shortly. So I want to start with our current political situation, not here but around the world. You know, Dr. King, one of his most famous lines was a statement, "The fierce urgency of now." And he called for immediate and vigorous positive action to end segregation and unequal treatment of African Americans. And he's used that in many speeches. That was one of his hallmark phrases. And the argument essentially that I'm going to be discussing with you today is that vigorous and positive action is necessary now as never before. It's necessary in the face of the rise globally of increasing intolerance, of racism, of xenophobia, as well as attacks on science and on knowledge and even on democracy itself. And the argument that I'll be presenting is that universities, more than any other institutions in the world, have an increasing responsibility to contribute to the advancement of knowledge. To the advancement of knowledge and the improvement of the human condition, which includes contributing to creating and sustaining fair, decent, tolerant, diverse, and just democratic societies. The roots of this in part come from roots that are deep. They're deep and can be looked to in terms of the Enlightenment. And Francis Bacon, the great philosopher of science and key to the Enlightenment, who wrote that knowledge is power. That's a separate quote that he made, and I'm merging them both, for the relief of man's estate. What Bacon argued was essentially the purpose of knowledge was to improve the world. And he critiqued ancient Greek and medieval studies as being too much engaged, and he termed it endless disputation and childish chatter. The test of knowledge was not just the test of does it improve conversation, but does it enhance human life? Does it have human beings function and live better? He also made contributions in his argument that the idea of advancing knowledge need to be looked at historically. That there was no set time or period to start and stop, but necessary to look at this in an historical way. But also Bacon had one terrible detriment in his work. He was a pure authoritarian in his approaches to knowledge. He actually had this idea of creating what he called the New Atlantis, a college of 26 leaders in which there would be people working for them in helping to manage this institution, and people who would contribute by doing some research. But there were 26 scholars who would determine knowledge, and above them all, telling them what to do, was Francis Bacon. So brilliant ideas in terms of this idea of knowledge for the relief of man's estate, to improve the world, the hope for the world. But yet he was going to tell the world what to do. Well, his heir in the United States was the founder of the University of Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin was an heir of Bacon, was actually created, as was Sandra mentioned last night, when he created the American Philosophical Society for practical and useful knowledge in Philadelphia, was modeled after Bacon's Royal Society. But the difference were twofold. Franklin really was, of all the founding fathers, the most democratic. He was an abolitionist as opposed to someone like Jefferson. He believed more essentially in women's rights than almost any other of the founders. He was a great, as we know, scientist, engineer, businessman, diplomat, revolutionary, who was an institution creator, from the fire company to the American Philosophical Society, to in fact a great scientist, as I said, making extraordinary discoveries, and again an institution builder. Philadelphia institutionally was formed by a group called the Junto that Franklin was the leader of. And Franklin, in his creation of institutions, the one he was proudest of was the creation of the University of Pennsylvania, in which it was also different from Bacon, because he said create a college, not a New Atlantis. And his college was different from any other colonial college in that he believed it was not, and I'll talk about this later, just for elites. He wanted every able-bodied at that time young man, to be able to go to the school. One reason he left Boston and came south to Philadelphia was the stultifying atmosphere of Boston and the elitism of Harvard. So he came south to Philadelphia to create an institution in which any person of ability, a young man of ability, could attend. And when he founded Penn, which was really in 1740 created, it wasn't really a college at the time. I think Penn chose that year. It was his charity school, so it could be formed 2 years ahead of Princeton, which was formed in 1742, because it really wasn't a college yet, but that's the year of its charter. But in 1749, he wrote a piece called Proposals for Educating the Youth of Pennsylvania, and in that piece he said the purpose of education, particularly the University of Pennsylvania, was to educate young men, young people with an inclination, moral, joined with an ability, intellectual, to serve. to serve mankind, human beings, one's country, friend, and family, which ability to serve is the great aim and end of all learning. It was the first higher educational institution in the world that was secular, not based on religion, that argued that service was the core to learning, was the purpose of learning. To educate for virtue is how he put it in the footnote. And that virtuous citizens would be engaged in service and care for others. Franklin's idea was crucial in terms of education. And one of the issues that gets raised is if higher education should fulfill and realize Franklin's vision, should realize Bacon's vision, now more democratic than Bacon, in fact, himself proposed, where have college and universities gone? In Jane Addams, the great settlement house workers, the feminist activist leader in many ways of the feminist movement and of the peace movement and a whole set of things, looked to higher education and said, you're not doing your job. She looked at not schools generally and said, and in 1899, as the college changed from teaching theology to teaching secular knowledge, the test of its success should have shifted from the power to save men's souls to the power to adjust them in healthful relations to nature and their fellow man. She actually, in an earlier paragraph, talked about this even further, and she said, you know, when religious colleges did not indicate their success by how holy they were, but how many people turned to God. That's how they judge their success. And she says, as you change from teaching theology to secular knowledge, the test should be adjusting human beings to healthful relations to nature and their fellow human beings. But the college failed to do this and made the test of its success the mere collecting and disseminating of knowledge, elevating the means of the work into an end and falling in love with its own achievements. Knowledge not for its own sake, that's a means. The collecting and dissemination wasn't enough, it was to improve the world. And she said as early as 1899, she didn't say what I'm going to say now, we're not realizing Benjamin Franklin. We're not realizing Francis Bacon. We're not realizing Jane Addams. And why colleges and universities? Well, I'm going to give a quick, very brief history of colleges and universities in the United States. Talk to you about Penn. Schools that preceded Penn were all founded on a religious basis. This is before I'll get to the university specifically. That is, they were founded on a religious basis from Harvard, Congregationalist, William and Mary, Anglican, Yale, Congregationalist, skipping Penn, Presbyterian would be Princeton, Dutch Reformed would be Rutgers, Brown would be Baptist, King's College, Columbia would be Anglican, Dartmouth Congregationalist, all of them to create Christian commonwealths to educate religiously orthodox men to be good citizens or ministers or service. And then there was Franklin. Service in a secular nature. We can jump to 1862 in the Morrill Act. It's President Lincoln signed to create land-grant colleges and universities. And land-grant colleges and universities had as their purpose educating adults, improving the life of the farmer on what was then the developing United States. And the great land-grant system most famously had the idea of the Wisconsin idea, which had as its notion the boundaries of the university or the boundaries of the state, and that in fact the idea was learning to improve the world, and then the development of research universities elsewhere. Hopkins, the first research university in the United States, said simply, Daniel Coit Gilman, universities should make for less misery among the poor. Certainly a mission for a Jesuit school, less misery among the poor, less ignorance in the school, less suffering in the hospital. This was the purpose. Hopkins hasn't achieved that, Penn has not achieved that. W.E.B. Du Bois at the University of Pennsylvania, who wrote the most significant initial ethnography by an individual ever written, emphasized the idea that the purpose of his research was the scientific basis of further study and of practical reform, not knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge to reform and make the world better. And then William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, which was probably the central place where this work at the turn of the 20th century gained leading energy, argued that it was universities that shaped the schooling system, that they were the reference institution for other schools. They wanted to be like them. And most important, we educated the most important people in our society. That is the teachers. The teachers. For from it proceeds, it says here, through the school system, every family in this entire broad land of ours is brought into touch with the university. For from it proceed the teachers or the teachers' teachers. Universities as the key institution in modern societies, And the rationale for university engagement is simple. And this is not in the United States, but around the world, where I'm going to turn shortly. The fate of universities and their local communities and cities are intertwined. As goes Scranton as a city, so will go University of Scranton. University of Scranton has enormous influence on what happens in this city. In Philadelphia, how goes Penn, Temple, LaSalle, Drexel, so will go the city of Philadelphia. How Philadelphia goes will affect those cities. We are intertwined in our environments. We're uniquely local, national, and global institutions, and universities can make significant contributions to the quality of life in their cities and their communities. Why? We're often among the largest employers. Why? We're often among the largest landholders. Why? We're often among the largest procurement centers for purchasing. Why? We're often centers of ideas and cultures. People coming together, convening in a forum like this. Why? We're often centers of technology, centers of business, centers of destination. People come to cities, and this is what they often go to see and visit. But most important, they have another resource: extraordinarily intelligent, idealistic students, faculty, and staff. The human resource is the most important. And universities, the key argument around the world is this is not just charity work. No, not in the slightest. It in fact is that universities can enhance their overall missions of teaching, research, and service and learning by striving to improve the quality of life in their community and schools. That is, by working on what might be termed universal problems, problems in your environment, like education, like poverty, like healthcare. By working on these problems in your environment, universities will be greater research universities. Will be able to teach better, will be able to instill values better if they do this, if they're engaged in this work. On the issue of citizenship, learning about citizenship, as is often said, is not a spectator sport. You have to do it, but you also have to study it. You have to study it. But if universities are distant from their neighbor, or beggar thy neighbor, or separate from their neighbor, what lessons are they teaching? What lessons? Bart Giamatti, when he was president of Yale, had a very simple phrase: universities teach far, 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 far more by what they do than by what they say. So what's happening now around the world? This is not just the United States. And I'll talk about a few examples, including that meeting that was attended by Sandra Mori and I. This work is increasingly recognized, more now than ever, that universities are what Derek Bok wrote in 1990, president of Harvard, the key institution in advanced society. Widely recognized, actually written by Clark Kerr, president of the University of California system in 1960s. It was written about by other people, including William Rainey Harper. But really, in 1990, Derek Bok said, universities are the key institution for determining the quality of life of societies. And he gave a number of reasons. And one issue he said is, if universities are so great in the United States, why do we have such pressing problems? Comparatively, around in terms of poverty and other issues, how wealthy we are as a country. But you know what's happened now? Around the world, those problems are more and more apparent, and increasingly people are seeing universities are the key institution for democratic development for a lot of the reasons I mentioned, including to educate leaders, including to educate people in technology and science, including to educate individuals for lifetimes of contribution. So they're now recognized widely. And in 1999, there was a Budapest Declaration passed in Europe by the Council of Europe, which is a group of 50, as it says, states in Europe. It's the oldest of the regional groups in Europe. It was formed by Churchill after World War II, when he made a speech about the necessity of democracies to come together. And the Council of Europe, this group and steering committee, has made a declaration on its 50th anniversary in 1999 saying that a democracy will develop in and through schooling. No democratic society if you do not have democratic schooling. That's what John Dewey, the great American pragmatic philosopher, wrote about. That's what was being stated in Europe. And meanwhile, there's a group in the United States talking about the same kind of conversation. Very similar discussions. In 1999, I was asked to co-chair then, and then eventually became chair, of this group, the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility, and Democracy, designed in effect to increase democracy on campus, in the community, in the city, in the region, and the wider society. And we had no idea what would happen. You can't join with the Council of Europe if you are Penn, or if you are University of Scranton. You have to bring a coalition together. So we had all the leaders of American higher education come together and sign some agreement, the head of associations, not of given universities, and we joined with the Council of Europe in a partnership and formed this consortium. And then we did a study called Universities as Sites of Citizenship, and that's what this refers to, the cross-national research projects. And what we did is we studied democracy on campus in 15 universities in Europe. We received money from the National Science Foundation, 16 in the United States. And what we found increasingly is that this work was important, but we weren't getting the job done. We weren't getting the job done. There were only a few universities in Europe who were taking this seriously, more in the United States, and the issue of why universities need to educate the next generation to be democratic citizens and had a role to play to advance this work and move it forward. So we started in 1999, and we issued a global declaration in 2006, and suddenly other countries were joining. Australia, South Africa, Korea, England separately joined, Ireland joined, and other countries begin to join, seeing the significance and the importance of this work. We began to hold global forums, and the forums that Maury and Sandra went to have people from all across Europe and around the world focusing on the issue of how universities can contribute democratically to their communities, to their own campus, to the wider society. 5 global forums, 5 books being published, but after the meeting, and I'll just touch on 2 that recently occurred, in 2014 there was a meeting, the one you saw in Belfast. And what did you hear about in Belfast? You heard stories, and I'm going to return to this, of how Queen's University, the center of the Irish peace movement, worked with people in the Ulster community, the Royalist, the Protestant community, and the Catholic community to bring together a divided society. You drive through Belfast, and you see murals on every other block to people who've died. You drive through Belfast, and you see fences between neighborhoods. When we were there, it was not too much before July 14th, which is the Battle of Boyne Water, the battle when William King of Orange won in terms of the Protestant community winning the war. And you'll see fences surrounding bonfires that haven't been lit yet, and 2 blocks away are the Irish Catholic communities. The more people died, as I understand, in the Troubles, percentage-wise, in any Civil War battle in history. I'll ask for Maury, the historian, also to look that up. When we were in Belfast, they told us that. The percentage of people who died in the Troubles, the battles that occurred from 1970 to the Easter, the signing of the peace agreements, were more percentage-wise than anywhere. So Queen's University, and I'll be talking more about this specifically, we heard about this, talked about the work it was doing in order to bring those communities together, to bring the school children together who go to sectarian schools or public schools and sectarian schools, to bring ex-prisoners together. And we heard a speech there of a guy who has been in prison for 10 years and probably committed some dastardly crimes, talking about books, not bombs. He said if it weren't for the university, we'd have none of these conversations in this city. And then we heard at that meeting people in Chester, Pennsylvania, at Widener University, Chester person, talking about their work, and I was on the board of trustees at that university at that time, talking about their work to bring together the university and one of the poorest cities, minority populations in the country. And we heard at that meeting the head of University South Africa talking about work being done in South Africa on those very same questions of communities and universities. And I can go on. And we just left a meeting in Rome, held at Lumsa University, that was at Queen's University, with even larger delegations from more countries all over the world on the issues of higher education for democracy. Well, I think it was higher education for diversity, inclusion, and democracy, talking about the immigrant crisis throughout Europe and what universities were doing, talking about the migrant and immigrant crisis in the United States, talking about the refugee crisis, talking about relationships democratically to their communities, all over talking about the rise of alternative facts and fake news and what that was doing to science and education, and every one of the leaders of those universities in even a larger group, co-sponsored also by Australian Catholic University, saying in effect, we, universities, now it is imperative that we deal with these phenomenally significant and difficult problems. And so since I'm chair of that group and want to touch on other organizations, the Taiwan Network has 360, we're not universities, this is societies that join the International Consortium and work with the Council of Europe. But Taiwan Network has 360 universities on the issue of civic engagement. And the Global University Network for Innovation has 260 universities working with UNESCO, also university-based, focusing more on issues of innovation for our developing society in a more developing societies, and also in a more democratic way across the world. Now I'm going to touch on this very quickly because I want to go back to the global, but I want to give some context to the work that is occurring around the world. And we're one example. And again, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I want to note that our center, and the reason, and Sandra really presented this exactly right, it is the issue of the global and local being linked, being connected. Let me touch on that for just a second. The first issue that's described is we are dealing with issues that are not Philadelphia, West Philadelphia issues. The issue of poverty and poor schooling are issues that exist here. They also exist in Northern Ireland. They also exist in Rome. I'll just pick the global. They also exist in Belfast. They exist in every city and community around the world. So the issue of local to global, what you're doing is you're focusing on local issues that are in fact occurring elsewhere so you can share and learn and make a difference. But also what Sandra indicated was global phenomena affect what happens in Philadelphia. And universities, think about it, are uniquely local in place, uniquely national, and uniquely global. We have national connections, we have global connections, but we are place-based. University of Scranton has links to other universities all over the world, to other Jesuit universities, but universities all over. I bet you there are programs linking universities across the United States and around the world, but where is it located? Here. Here. It has a place. So what we try to do is take issues, and I'll touch on these issues quickly, that connect to those global or universal issues that are occurring locally. And what we do is we emphasize three things. One is this issue of, and I'll touch on all these quickly, academically based community service, which is a form of service learning, building this work into the curriculum, university-assisted community schools, an overall approach. Then this idea of anchor institutions, as institutions in communities and what they do, and then we share those as a model for democratic university community partnerships and engagement all over the world. Let me just touch on academically based community service. It's a very simple idea, and I met with a group of colleagues from University of Scranton who are doing the same thing. That's the idea, is that service is not separate from the curriculum. It's fine to do volunteer service, but the key is it needs to be part of academic work. And what that means, in effect, is you have courses in which students learn by engagement in the community, and it's linked to their readings and the education that they do. You know, if you think about that work, it really is the idea that John Dewey wrote about, in the sense that he said people learn thinking occurs in a forked road situation where there is a problem to solve, a forked road. And what we try to do is have our students focus on problems in the community, working with the community. So you have a picture here of a physics chair who's now Dean of Arts and Associate Dean of Natural Sciences, teaching a physics course to students in a poor urban high school. But he's not teaching to them. He's teaching his students who learn physics by teaching it in the public schools, who learn philosophy by teaching it in the public schools, who learn about Plato's Republic, we don't have that anymore, but we used to in classical studies, by teaching it in the public schools, who learn about lead poisoning by running lead projects in the public schools, who have students help contribute, in my class, to college access while they write research papers on improving the partnership between the university and the community. And there are 70 courses and about 1,700 students. We started, and it's our 25th anniversary, with 4 courses and I guess 100 or so students. So it's been growing, but this is not just here, but around the world. University Assisted Community Schools is an idea, and I'll touch on this again very quickly, that comes from Jane Addams and from John Dewey. It's schools as centers of neighborhoods. Settlement house workers knew that settlements were scattered, but schools were everywhere. So settlement house workers, which provide services to people, settlement house workers said, what if we bring that into the school and provide education for adults and children in the school? And then Dewey, taking that idea, he was influenced enormously by Addams, said, what if every school became a center of a neighborhood? Then we can have real democracy. And what we've done is taken Dewey's ideas in pedagogy, learning by engagement and critical reflection and doing, and learning from the doing, and the idea of schools as hubs, and brought it together and said universities should be partners, and we work together at those schools to make them schools that serve the entire neighborhood, children and adults, have health centers, have programs for youth, have job training programs, and have an academic curriculum, again, tied to the learning, where the school children learn by helping to solve problems like improving the nutrition in the neighborhood. And we have something like 13 courses on health and nutrition working there. And all those courses I just described, they're not in separate places. Mostly we bring them together in the school, so it builds community. It builds neighborhood. It aggregates resources. It integrates resources. And simultaneously we bring volunteer resources in, as I talk about here, in work-study, academic internships, volunteers. So we bring about 2,000 students to 5 West Philadelphia schools with faculty to make a difference in the neighborhood. And what else? Advance research, teaching, service, and learning. The faculty who do this write about it and write books about it. I wrote a book, I'm not a nutritionist, but I wrote a book with a colleague who's a great physical anthropologist, Frank Johnston, on the obesity culture. Talking about if you want to deal with obesity, everyone knows how to deal with obesity, it's the implementation that counts. And we talk about the approach and why this matters. So that's our approach, and the final part of the approach is, which I'll talk about in a bit, is going to be anchor institutions. But let's talk about around the world. What's really happening? Sandra made a claim, it's global. Well, I cited places. Well, what are they doing at 2 places globally? And I can cite more, but time, I want to make sure we have a lot of time for questions. I've been doing a lot of work with South Africa since 1999. But in 1997, following the Democratic Revolution and vote in 1994, there was a white paper. And the paper called on universities needed to commit to social responsibility for the common good. Now, none of these things are simple. But I can just tell you, one of the early recognitions in South Africa, democratic South Africa, was not going to be achieved merely by a democratic revolution, which is one of the most extraordinary events in our lifetime and in human history. In human history, that there was no rancor and violence, but they knew it was not enough. And a lot of the young people didn't go to school during that period of the revolution. So it became particularly important to get them back into those schools. And they said, we have to demonstrate social responsibility into the common good. And then the Higher Education Council in South Africa, formed also after the Democratic Revolution, established knowledge-based community service as a requirement. Notice, knowledge-based, not just community service. I probably heard this from Sandra a few times. Not just community service, but knowledge-based as a requirement for accreditation of the institutions. And then this became in all 21, and now there are more South African universities. And I became involved in 1999 with a project called CHESP, Community Higher Education South African Higher Education Service Partnerships. It was for post-apartheid South Africa to create partnerships for the reconstruction and development of civil society and transform higher education to meet societal needs. And 8 South African universities were teamed with 8 U.S. universities. PED was teamed with University of Johannesburg. Wits University, Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And as I recall, University of Cape Town was teamed with Stanford. And I can go through the list, but the key issue was we worked together. This was earlier days on how do we learn from each other's experience. I want to make this clear. The Netter Center is often seen as the model, the center I run, but I want to make this clear. We have not cracked that atom. We learn constantly from our partners, and we learn from South African universities. And I was asked to be on the board. I was the American put on the board for that project. And the learnings that I took on seeing the work they were doing in their communities, in very different circumstances, but on many of the same problems, informed our work back here. And that project, CHESP, proved seminal in the future of where South Africa has gone. The national plan for the whole country emphasized the issue of community engagement as one of 3 core functions of universities, along with research and teaching. And perhaps most importantly, their National Science Foundation. And I do a great deal of work for the National Science Foundation here in the United States and chair a committee on these issues for the National Science Foundation. Not only released its vision, but inaugurated a community service program providing $117 million to 17 projects over 3 years. And this quote's important. The decision to initiate investment in community engagement signaled the National Research Foundation commitment to better support research into and about community engagement for knowledge production, innovation, human capital development to align more closely with higher education's mandate of research, teaching, and community service. National platform. And then I chaired an international workshop that involved these issues with leadership from the United States, China, and South Africa. And we did a white paper on how to achieve equity in science, technology, and engineering and math, and diversity through higher education community engagement. A white paper funded by NSF with white papers in South Africa and China serving as an example of where this can go forward. And one other example before I bring this together and we have time to chat. When we were in Queen's University, Belfast, I gave some background about that. But what I learned, and I've worked with them since 2004 and even a bit before, also around 1999, is the issue that we all face common questions, but there are different deep historical situations. South Africa was apartheid. It's a majority country of people of African background, not minority. It's a situation in which the majority population is much poorer and left out. In this country, clearly we're majority non-people of African descent and still non-minority, although that's growing. Very different circumstances. And Belfast is also very different circumstances. This is a story of a deeply divided society with tremendous political violence. And the university took this on as a crucial issue. And they developed projects with the community doing research together. So they would have teams, so they get to know each other. They widen participation in the university to help build academic skills in the community. For younger children, 14 to 18, before they're at the university, they have this key idea and links to our work in West Philadelphia of shared education. Here, in our case, it's between the university and the community, and theirs was across sectarian schools, which still exists very deeply. Separate school systems. And how do we build collaborative network? They developed a prison to peace program, and that's partly what we heard about, where ex-prisoners share with school students how they need to prevent violence and find an alternative way. They also have knowledge transfer, where they have initiatives providing jobs to graduates of the local schools in small and medium-sized businesses. And what we learned is we do similar things in West Philadelphia. We have a pipeline program for high school students to work in cardiology, neurology, GI, and in the vet school to learn their curriculum and get jobs at the medical center of the University of Pennsylvania. Very similar, but different career paths, but similar issues. And then they have national drivers. So similar. This is before the recent developments in Europe and the United States became so visible, before Brexit, before the current elections. But the idea that they were concerned with the loss of confidence in science, in knowledge. How do you build a better world if you have no confidence in science and knowledge? Human beings' greatest contributions are the ideas that we produce that have advanced human life. And so that they work to create new criteria where they talked about social impact of the work. They talked about funded research projects that needed to have an impact in the world. It's not enough to have a good conversation. Question of a good conversation that's part of a wider conversation outside the walls. That's why forums like this for wider engagement is so important. And then beyond that, how these ideas can translate into better human life. That's what universities used to do. That's what land grants did. That's what University of Chicago did when it was tied to the school system, when William Rainey Harper copied Jane Addams, copied her idea for Hull House and said, I'm going to build a university like that. And he said the universities were the prophets of democracy and needed to be in communities of the poor. What people often don't remember, and I just wrote about in a book that I did with colleagues, is that William Raynor Harper tried to have a hostile takeover of Hull House. Try to take over Hull House. He said, we'll pursue your permanence. And Jane Addams wrote a scathing letter saying, we are activist women. Our contributions are to make a difference, and it's part of our own development, part of development in the community. We stand for certain things. We were there first. You could assure our permanence, but you can't assure that we're going to do what we do. And she wrote this sharp letter to him, and she quoted Dewey and William James, two great scholars, saying, they're with us. And so even though Harper did great things, there are always more delicate questions that one has to look at as an historian. So the issue, though, is this idea. Universities used to do that, and research have tangible benefits. Anthropology, they talk about what they did with the community to help with resolution, working with disciplines across different fields to look at options for conflict transformation and the impact of devolution and knowledge exchanges. But very importantly is what's happening now with Brexit. The Irish peace process in part was tied to the European Union. The reason for that was the European Union, in one regard, provided money, to be frank, to in fact assure that there would be projects cross-nation. And I was part of one of those projects. I gave a talk in 2005 in Belfast about these issues. I'll just tell one quick story about that. I landed in Belfast. I'm very tired. It was, I believe, some major cup in soccer. Liverpool, whose colors are red, was in fact very tied to the people of Northern Ireland. A lot of them have left their families still in Liverpool, some with a long history. I happen to be wearing a red shirt, which I usually don't wear. They all assumed that this Yank had come over to root for Liverpool at these huge parties. And while I went down for dinner, and they talked to me, and they said I was wearing red, they picked me up on their shoulders and started, and they had nothing to do with the university. And I like soccer, but I really wanted to go to my room and go to sleep. I had to stay up and hang with these people until the game was over, and they marched down the street. So that was my experience that week, unrelated to this talk, but unrelated to what I'm speaking about, but true story. So the Queen's has to deal with this, and also the EU provided a sense of going beyond rigid boundaries. What happened? UK is no longer going to be part of the EU. They no longer have that money, and boundaries are getting tightened. So what are they doing? They have academics across the university working on research to inform Brexit process and public opinion, and a website, and they're working constantly. And I think about this in our own work in West Philadelphia. We're involved in bringing largely white, largely privileged young people into connections with poorer African American and, in some cases, Hispanic youth. And doing this with other universities throughout the city in their own neighborhood, bringing cultures together, working on common problems, doing research that brings people together. There are great similarities in different historical contexts. What's happening in South African universities, opening up those universities to all people, and also having elites who are African being related to poor people who are still outside those universities. Universal problems as manifested locally, but with deeply different historical contexts. You can never take an idea like university-assisted community schools and translate it to any country. You could take approaches. But you can take maybe the idea, but you can't take the specificity of West Philadelphia. But this is growing all over the world. And now the next phase, as I conclude, another activity that Sandra's been very involved in is a group that I chaired initially. I wrote a report, chaired a report for Secretary Donovan, Sean Donovan, who was Secretary of HUD, on the role of higher education as an anchor institution in improving their communities. And that group, I had no idea what would happen, but once I wrote the report, I was asked by 19 other colleagues who were on that committee to please chair a group. And we started to chair an organization called the Anchor Institutions Task Force. And the Anchor Institutions Task Force was not just about higher education, but what's the role of hospitals and academic medical centers and community foundations and libraries as anchors, rooted institutions helping their communities. The idea that they can bring their work together, and for universities and some businesses like Prudential, an insurance company in Newark, that are long-term partners. It's bringing their resources to bear to help the community. But for universities, it's more than that. It's bringing academic resources together. And the group has grown to 700 people, leaders, often university presidents, activist partners, leaders of universities, leaders of hospitals, of foundations, and civic leaders come and join and are part of those conversations. We're actually having a meeting, a fifth or sixth forum in New York next week. And it's a values-based movement. It's not just partnership, based in collaboration and partnership, equity and social justice, democracy and democratic practice, and commitments to place and community. So it's not just engagement, but to larger values. And the thing that's happened is, as Sandra was indicating, this has now become a global movement. When I was at that meeting in Europe, in Rome, there was another meeting that I chaired right before the larger meeting with the Council of Europe. And it was on creating an anchor institution task force in Europe. And it was held at the Congregation of Catholic Education overlooking the Vatican with delegates, a small selected group from 30 countries of Europe. But they also had delegates from South Africa attending that meeting, in Australia. And it said about Melbourne and the work we've done in Australia, I never thought the anchors work would get attracted in Australia. And I just was on a telephone call with the person who heads Engagement Australia. And he said, anchor institutions is now becoming an approach that we're looking at for universities across Australia. And this idea that we have a reason to do this work linked to our academic work, but also the institutional, place-based nature of the university is having global implications. And in the United States, I'll just cite these two universities quickly, Rutgers University Newark and University of San Diego, that have said their purpose now is as an anchor institution. Their purpose. to advance knowledge through local engagement on universal problems as they are manifested locally, and to bring all the resources together. So as a good Pennsylvanian, I'm going to conclude with Franklin and then a quote from the book that my colleagues and I just did. It seems the principles that we're looking at are these principles that Franklin wrote about. Talked about one of them, purposes of education. Inclination, moral, joined with an ability to serve. As he said 1 year later, there is nothing is more of importance to the public weal than to form and train up youth in wisdom and virtue. He says, you can have leaders who are rich and powerful, but if they do not have civic virtue, terrible things will result. The most important thing. And he also said toward the end of his life that the greatest obstacle was what he termed, but there is, when he criticized Penn trustees, which he was, and he left the trustees, he either was kicked off or he left, and he was angry. He never attacked people unnecessarily, but he figured he was getting older, he actually was quite ill, he knew he was very sick, and he said, I'm going to say it as I believe it. You never did what I told you. You didn't create an English school and wanted to teach in English, you kept teaching Greek and Latin like every other school. You never did what I told you, so I'm going to say what blocked you was there is in mankind an unaccountable prejudice in favor of ancient customs and habitudes, which inclines to a continuance of them after the circumstances which formerly made them useful cease to exist. The dead hand of tradition. We always did it that way. We always were elitists. This wasn't always true, as I showed you, but we always were separate from the world. And we're going to continue doing that, and we're going to continue to be internal. And he said, ancient customs and habitudes. So what I essentially have argued, which I write about with my colleagues, I will summarize in one paragraph. Only connect the powerful, evocative epigraph to E.M. Forster's Howard's End captures the essence of my argument, namely that the necessary revolutionary transformation of research universities is most likely to occur in the crucible of significant, serious, sustained engagement with local public schools and local schools in general and their communities. Abstract, solipsistic, contemplative, ivory tower isolation will neither shed intellectual light on our most significant societal problems nor produce positive democratic change. It will not get us where we need to go. To put it more positively, we conclude this book as we began, by calling on democratic-minded academics, and I would say citizens, but calling on democratic academics to create and sustain a global movement to radically transform research universities to realize Bacon's goal of advancing knowledge for the relief of man's estate, as well as John Dewey's vision of an organic great community composed of participatory, democratic, collaborative, and interdependent societies all over the world. Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions, polite and friendly amendments and not so friendly amendments. So it's all open now. Yes, and please say your name. I think they're going to get you a microphone so we can record these important comments.
Oh, not so important. I'm Ricky Hines from Thornhurst and Drexel Hill.
Nice to meet you.
On NPR, they've been having a very interesting discussion, and I don't remember the name of the school. It's a school that they started last year with 100 students, and a very bad neighborhood. And they took these 100 students, and the whole purpose of this school is to keep the children there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when there is an incident, they have a circle.
Right, right.
And they bring their parents.
Right.
A child is never disciplined by putting them out of the school.
Right.
And it was so impressive to hear what they're doing.
Right.
They're now in their second year.
Right.
And that's what we need. We need to keep the kids in school.
Absolutely.
The second thing I want to say.
And just one thing to note, that's what university assisted community schools are designed to do.
Okay.
We're not there yet, but to be 24-hour-a-day institutions. We are open into the evenings and on weekends sometimes, but that's really the idea.
One of the things I'm proudest about of being sort of a Philadelphian is the mural project.
Yes.
And I've talked to you about this quite often. One of the wonderful things was I've taken 2 of the tours. Especially, I went to the West Philadelphia one, the first one.
Right.
And how they involve the schools
We work
in
with
all
them.
these murals. And how each mural is the product of either the school or the community. And it is just amazing to see what this community joy
That's right.
has brought to West Philadelphia. I couldn't
Absolutely.
believe it when we
Absolutely.
drove through West Philadelphia.
Right.
And all the dilapidated houses were gone, and they have beautiful green spaces. It's really amazing what can be done within the community.
You know, just if those of you who aren't aware of that, there's a Philadelphia Murals Arts Project. And that project does murals all over the city of Philadelphia. And our work began in 1985, even before we were a center. And our first projects were with mural arts. And still to this day, they teach through our center. So we do projects at Comegys schools and others where the mural arts staff teach with Penn faculty or as lecturers and work with our students, working with the schools to do murals. So there'll be murals of different leading figures in the city, people in the community, visions of a landscape, and they're done through deep democratic consultation. And we're very proud that many of those murals you saw came through the work that we do in West Philadelphia. So that was a great advertisement for what we do. So that was great, thank you. And they do most of it. They deserve most of the credit, but we work closely with them, at least in West Philly. They do it citywide. Any other questions, critiques?
Yes, Ira.
Yes, Nora.
There is, in some circles, a current criticism of universities in that, and particularly faculty, have an inordinate role in influencing the political process, and particularly one of the major political parties, which obviously you'll recognize, and that is some kind of segment of identity politics, and that the political efforts should move out of the universities and the faculties into a more universal approach.
Right.
Would you comment on that?
So let me deal with that and even take Maury's very good question and broaden it a bit in the sense of the role of university faculty in teaching about politics. Let me take it even broader. There's a critique about our teaching values, about teaching general issues in which we express how we feel. So let me make at least my position clear. You can't teach without view, and let me put it even more directly, teaching and education are inherently moral enterprises. By not talking about certain issues and things, you are making a statement about what matters and doesn't matter. Why would you study history, and I'm a trained historian, if the purpose of history, in most, not for every, but most historians, is to make the world better? And you have a vision of that world. I want to teach my students skills to be citizens, and I am unabashed in that position. However, what I should not do is tell them they have to think precisely and how to vote, and that's not a right or left-wing issue. So you could be the most liberal or conservative faculty member and not do that. Or you could be someone who's in the center and said, be in the center, I want you to take these stands, I want you to write that way. So I am very clear in my classes, they know what I think, and they'll know what I think politically. But I don't want them to think as I think politically, but I want them to think about politics. I want them to be engaged. I want them to understand the material. I want them to learn how to work collaboratively. And I tell them the goal of my seminar is essentially to develop their empathetic, collaborative, and problem-solving skills and help them develop their values and to become engaged citizens. So I think the critique is wrong-headed, the way it's done. I think the critique would be not right or left, but the role of universities are indeed to advance values, to express opinions, to state where you feel, but my role in the classroom should not be to have the students act as I do politically, but to think more creatively, to work better collaboratively, and to develop as citizens. And the biggest critique has been, and I told Sandra, but I've been attacked in literature about this recently. I was criticized for saying what I just said to you now. And my position is universities, as I pointed to, had as their hallmark development of caring, creative, democratic citizens for democracy. And if they lose that, they are no business in existing. So that's my slightly sharp response to that critique. Thank you very much. Yes, your name, sir.
To piggyback on Maury's question.
And can I have your name just so I...
Richard.
We met Richard, that's right. Now I remember, yeah.
We all should be aware that Donald Trump was a graduate
A pen.
of the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes. I'm well aware of that.
How
It's
is
something I
that?
prefer not being reminded of. Go ahead, Richard, I'm sorry. How is
For-
that? That's a good question.
For the university community, and I don't know where Maury's sense of things is. Well, he told me his wife doesn't either. Anyhow, because we have an existential crisis facing us coming out of the White House, is there anything the obviously he didn't understand, or this was well before
Way
him,
before.
this model you have put
Right,
together.
right.
But it seems pretty important that places that he's graduated
Right, right.
from, in a sense, speak of what kind of graduate he is.
Right.
Is there anything afoot that way?
Well, I think there are a few things, Phil. The first, I want to deal with that issue. I would argue, I'll say what Richard said directly, that I can't say you can never claim one individual, but certainly I would argue that it's not just that we started later, that it's a sign of a failure that would educate people with that orientation, too many of them. In other words, the university fails if it does that, and that would make that clear. The second issue is plans afoot, and I'll respond in three ways. The first is there has been a group of alums who've actually written about this and expressed their opinion. Second, our president currently, Amy Gutmann, has been certainly the leader among elite presidents, criticizing Trump's position on DACA, on immigration generally, and after Charlottesville, she had a statement. She has been the leading president of an elite university taking a public stand. But I'm going to take that further. It seems to me the response, and that's why I started with that slide in King and the fierce urgency of now, the response to Trump significantly is for universities to actually focus on those values and do this work deeply in a fundamental, central way of the institution, standing foursquare for science, for knowledge, for improving the world, and working together. So I say to my students, and we've had forums throughout the city of Philadelphia, a group I also started called FEN, Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development, which has 30 institutions in the region as part of it, that we've had meetings on how do we work with our public schools and local schools and communities, and we've titled those meetings The Fierce Urgency of Now because of the rise of intolerance, of racism, of xenophobia, etc. So I believe that the idea that universities need to take isn't just to state it politically. That gets sometimes difficult. It can be stated in some ways, but the way it needs to be stated is a clear rebuke by what we do. And I'm going to be chairing a meeting of the 25th anniversary of my university on November 16th and 17th. I don't know what I'm going to say when I introduce that meeting, but I assure you it's going to be that universities as never before have the obligation to show that what they are doing is standing for the highest human values and in opposition to the current positions that are being taken here and around the world by political leaders. So, amen, Richard. Amen. Okay. Greek strongly. Great question. Any other? Yes, gentleman back there.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm a faculty member here. My name is Satya Chattopadhyay.
Nice to meet you.
And I was going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about your thoughts on safe spaces on university campuses.
Good
University of
question.
Chicago led that off last year. I've discussed this with my first-year seminar students here, and I have a sense of where they lie, but I wanted to hear from you.
So I think that, let me put it in a different way. I think it depends what you mean by safe spaces. So I think universities should be challenging and should be fully dedicated to free speech and expression. Having said that, you want to have a civil, tolerant institution, which means, in fact, the idea is that name-calling, racism, attacking people personally for who they are and what they are should not be permitted in a classroom. But that's different than discussing disparate ideas. I don't worry about teaching texts that are going to get my students upset. Because when I was in college, I was taught texts that got me upset. And they either made me change or made me stronger in what I believe. So they need to be centers of free expression and free speech and openness, but they can't be places that negate the values of civility, tolerance, honesty, truth, and decency. And that's a different question. So I don't believe classrooms should be safe spaces against ideas. I believe the institution should stand for certain general principles and be open to free expression across the board. But if I have a class, and I had this at one time, I'll give a story about this. The African American students, freshmen, who were attacked by racist emails, I don't know if you recall this, right after Trump's election, it was front page of the New York Times. I had taught 3 African American freshmen in that class. And we talked about those issues and discussed them. And people would express different feelings and opinions that were fine. But to have in a classroom that discussion is fine. But the emails were an atrocity, calling for the hanging and death of those kids. And if that's what they did, and in fact, universities have to stand up against that, well, you need to have conversations in your classroom. And that's how I feel about it. So we experienced it, and that's another, all very good questions. Terrific. Any other thoughts, concerns, questions? So let me just say again to thank all of you. I also want to say that if you want to hang around to sign any books, I get no profits from the book. It goes back to the Netter Center. I just want you to know that. I say that always because I don't want to feel I'm not for filling my own pockets ever. And I want to, first of all, then thank you all very much, and I enjoyed this. So thank you.
I second Ira's suggestion that you look at the books, have one signed, and take it home, because if you learned a lot today, you'll learn even more after that. I'm very grateful that you took the time to come here, Ira, and we'll have you come back. Thank you. And David Wenzel will kill me if I don't just remind you to come to the United Nations Association luncheon on Tuesday. Thank you. Oh,